most of the Great Plains, we have issues with woody plants growing in areas that they historically didn't grow. And so we're using prescribed fire to try to set those plants back. But we have a predicament because we're both trying to grow fuel and we're trying to grow forage. And so there's kind of a cycle that's happening. And we commonly say fuel first, forage second. And the reason that we say that is that we need to be able to grow enough fuel to make sure that we can burn so that our grasses aren't having to compete with our woody plants to grow. And so when you have a lot of woody plants growing, you have a decrease in your forage production. And so if we make sure that we have enough fuel, we can get good kill on those woody plants if they're non-resprouting. If they are resprouting, we can set them back, and we can make sure that we have enough resources, sunlight and moisture for our forage species to grow. So in Oklahoma, the plant that we commonly think of is eastern red cedar. That's true in Kansas, Nebraska. It goes all the way north as far as Ames. Ames is as far north in Iowa that I've seen it. But we have eastern red cedar here in Texas, and in Texas we have blueberry juniper, redberry juniper, pinch oats juniper. It's functioning the same. It's a relative of eastern red cedar. It's also encroaching into what was historically grasslands. If you go to New Mexico, it's one seed juniper. This is happening all over the United States. And so here in Oklahoma, in this part of Oklahoma, we can grow almost 5,000 pounds per acre of forage. When you calculate a stocking rate for that, it's going to take about 8 acres to support a 1,000-pound cow year-round. Of course, nobody grazes 1,000-pound cows, so we have to tweak that number a little bit. But if you had an 80-acre pasture, you could have 10 cows in there year-round if they weighed 1,000 pounds. If you have 80% cedar cover, your forage production is going to drop to about 1,300 pounds per acre. And at 1,300 pounds per acre, you have moved to the shortgrass prairie, and you now live in Colorado or northeast New Mexico. You're not in the most productive area even in the shortgrass prairie. And so your stocking rates have changed drastically. It's not going to take you 27 acres to support a 1,000-pound cow for a year. So you can put 3 cows in your 80 acres year-round. So the research that was done here found that with every 10% increase in cedar cover, we get a drop in about 400 pounds per acre on our forage growth. So you can see that it's a big decrease when we allow eastern red cedar to grow in areas that we are trying to push it towards a grassland or a prairie. So a question that people commonly ask me about growing season prescribed fire is, if I burn, I'm going to burn up all of my forage. And so there was some research that was done, and it was done in a greenhouse, and they picked little blue stem, and they picked this plant specifically because none of our native grasses are super sensitive to fire, but of the native grasses, this one seems to be one that can be sensitive if you have a drought prior to or after, like a wildfire. So they picked this grass and they grew it in a greenhouse, and at 18 months of age, they started burning and clipping. So they had some plants that they just burnt, or that they burnt and clipped, some plants that they clipped only, and the clipping was trying to simulate what grazing would do to these plants. And they did it on young plants, like 18 months old is not very old for these plants. So they thought, if we're gonna hurt these plants, this is the age that we'll do it. And so if you look at this graph that I've included in the handout, the dark bars here are showing the biomass of the plants that had been burnt and clipped. And then these little short bars that are light colored are the ones that were simply clipped. And so you can see that burning, the plants that were burnt and clipped, grew a lot more above ground biomass than the plants that were only clipped. And so those plants responded positively to the burning and the clipping. So the next question that people commonly ask was like, well, why did that happen? Are they just are they taking all of their resources from their root system and putting it all into leaf growth? Are they going to be less drought tolerant? So they also looked at the biomass of the root systems. And so on the next page, again, these dark bars are the burnt and clipped 1, 2, or 0 times, and then the unburned are the lighter bars. And the plants that were burnt and clipped, again, had bigger root systems than the plants that were only clipped. And so there's a couple different mechanisms that could be causing this to happen. One of the things that might be happening is that when we burn, we do volatilize some of our nitrogen. And so those plants might be trying to compensate and growing bigger root systems to try to capture nitrogen, because nitrogen is always limited in our native systems. And there could be some kind of hormonal feedback that's telling the plants to grow more roots to respond to the fire. You know, there's a couple different things that could be doing this, but we do know that it's been proven in multiple research studies that burning increases root production on our native grasses. So that's good. And these plants were actively growing. These weren't dormant plants. They were actively growing when they burnt them. The next question that people often ask me is about erosion. Well, if I burn during the growing season, my pasture is just going to blow away, or it's going to rain and it's just going to run away. You know, it's just going to erode. So there was some research that was done out at Woodward. And if you're familiar with Woodward, it's a really, really sandy area. And if there was an area that was going to blow, this is the spot it would happen. So they had dormant season burns and growing season burns, and they compared the sediment that blew off of these sites. They did the burns in September and October, and they were pretty extreme burns, as close to a wildfire situation as they could get. And what they found was they collected sediment at 2 different heights, and there was some soil movement, and that's innate to these systems. If you're in a sandy system, there will be sediment that's moving. But the sediment movement was more linked to whether the soils were wet. They collected this for 2 years, and 1 year was wet and 1 year was dry. And they had more sediment movement when there was dry soils and little plant growth. In the year where they had wet soils and plant growth, they had very little sediment that was moving. And with all of this research, they had no major blowouts found on any of these sites, and it didn't decrease the production of the forage grasses in any of their plots. So the next question that I'm going to get to is the one that I was promised to talk about, which is quality, forage quality. What does growing season burning do to forage quality? If you look at some of this research, this was from some research that was done here, and they had dormant season burns and growing season burns, and they looked at forage crude protein relative to those different burn treatments. They did this for 4 years, and what they found was that in 2 of the 4 years, the forage quality of plants that they clipped in July bumped from a 4% crude protein to 16% crude protein after the burn. And that's a significant bump. If you're grazing stockers in Oklahoma, typically from July on, you're going to be using some type of protein supplement, because our grasses have started to put on their seed heads, their quality has dropped significantly, and it'll just stay low until the next spring. But with a growing season burn, you can bump up that forage quality quite a bit if it rains. So that's something interesting that we found. The other thing interesting about that research is that the forage remained high through end of November. So November 30th, the crude protein was 7%, which, you know, you're trying to stay at 6 to 8% crude protein for that in the forage quality, so that your rumen the microbes in the rumen can continue to function. If you drop below that, you're going to have some microbes that are dying off. And so if we can try to stay higher, we don't have to supplement. Once we drop below, we have to start supplementing. So we'll talk about how we can do that in this next part. Who in here is trying to do prescribed burning as well as graze cattle on the same pasture in the same year? You are? You got a hand here? So how do you change your grazing management to make sure that you have both fuel and forage?
I'm learning.
You're learning? Well, in one of the groups, they said, well, we go ahead and just defer for the whole year prior to burning. And that's what was commonly done in the past, was pretty long deferment of grazing. You know, in the Flint Hills, in areas that they're using intensive early stocking, where they're only grazing animals during the first half of the growing season. They grow enough fuel then from July through September to go ahead and have fuel for the next spring to burn. But researchers here were wondering, how do we have both fuel and forage when we're grazing continuously, when we're grazing year-round in that same pasture? And so they thought, well, let's just try burning a part of the pasture and see what happens. And what happened was that cattle concentrated their use on those recently burnt patches. And so within a pasture, they burnt a third of that pasture each year during the dormant season. So they burnt 1/3, then the next year they'd burn another third, then the next year they'd burn another third. And those animals would spend up to 75% of their time on that recently burned patch. And when they burnt the next patch, they'd move on to the next patch. So then they took it to the next level and they said, let's divide it into 6 patches. We'll burn 1 during the dormant season and 1 during the growing season. And what they found was that they could reduce supplement by 150 pounds in the patch burned pastures versus the traditionally burned pastures during the winter months. And so in the traditionally burned, it's just burnt, the whole thing's burnt every 3 years. In the patch burn, you have a patch burnt, 2 patches burnt every year. And so they had a reduction in supplement, no reduction in stocking rate, and no reduction in livestock performance in those pastures. And they, like I said, they kept the same stocking rates. There's other benefits too with patch burn grazing. And so there's been research on different wildlife species, and you can create these very different habitats in close proximity to each other that allows for wildlife to use them really efficiently. And you can also reduce the external pests that are found on livestock. So horn flies are reduced with patch burn grazing, and ticks are reduced with patch burn grazing. Ticks, of course, are vectors or carriers of anaplasmosis. This is not a good deal for livestock, and so we can reduce the amount of ticks we have when we use patch burn grazing. I haven't found any research that's said that. I've looked at a lot of research with prescribed fire and with wildfire. Under some wildfire conditions, of course, you can have plants suppressed for a couple of years. I haven't been able to find any where they actually, you had fewer plants, that you actually had plants dying, unless there was an extended drought like right after that burn. But no, not just due to season of burn. Yes, Bermuda grass is very grazing tolerant, and most of the mechanisms that helps it to be grazing tolerant are the same mechanisms that help it to be fire tolerant. I think part of what we're trying to do with the patch burn grazing, I think that you could definitely spike the forage quality later in the season with burning it. I don't think there's any reason that Bermuda grass wouldn't also increase in quality if you were doing patch burn grazing with growing season burns. There's a lot of people that burn it in New Mexico in the spring, and they're part of that is that they're trying to kill some of the broadleaf plants that would likely come up in it. But I don't know that there's been any research on patch burning on Bermuda grass.